Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's special webinar, where the subject that we will be discussing is civil discourse in an uncivil age. I'm very happy to have joining us today Mr. Alexander Hefner from the United States of America, who has done a lot of documenting of contemporary U.S. history and the trials and tribulations that the U.S. is currently going through. Uh, Mr. Alexander Hefner is an author and a historian and is host of The Open Mind on the PBS network. He has covered American politics, civic life, and millennials since the 2008 presidential campaign. His writing has appeared in the Daily Beast, The Independent, USA Today, Wired, Time, the New York Daily News, the New York Times Room for Debate section, the Boston Globe, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, among a bevy of other publications. He is co-author of the best-selling A Documentary History of the United States, which was originally published in 2018, and he has recently updated the book with a new chapter uh, called um, Populists Revolt, Democracy Under Duress. In this chapter, Mr. Alexander explores contemporary American global politics and the digital age through critical documents, speeches, testimonies, and tweets. He posits the question, what impact are the current media and political climate having on the first draft of history, contemporary history? He has lectured at a number of universities and institutions around the world, including in the US and in Australia, as well as in Denmark. And we are very happy to have him here with us today at the American University in Cairo. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Alexander and ask him to tell us a little bit about his book and a little bit about the very exciting and very dramatic US elections that we just witnessed a few weeks ago. Alexander?
Thank you so much, Professor. It's an honor to be with you and the community virtually. I hope at some point in the future to be with you in the flesh, in person. But I'm grateful to you and your colleagues for your interest in my work and in the subject of history versus fake news and the future of civil discourse. I come at this as a professional journalist, but one with an eye for public education, because the media platform on which my program airs, The Open Mind, was designed not as an entertainment channel, but as a source of public knowledge and information. When PBS was founded, it was originally conceived as an educational network, NET, and then one of the landmark channels that it continues to this day, WNET, here in New York City, where I'm speaking to you today. Of course, there's WTTW in Chicago, and a variety of stations that are the underpinnings of the public system, but it was founded as the educational telecommunications apparatus foundation. You'll know WGBH as well. WNET, WGBH, and WTTW are the founding stations of the public media complex. WGBH based in Boston. The book provides a lens into how we document a tumultuous point in our history when there are different formats and we have to consider, well, our Facebook posts or our tweets or our podcast part of the fundamental documentary evidence of how we ought to understand evolving events. And I think there's no doubt they are. They're not just influential because they are the new primary sources of this generation, in the way that you and your colleagues and any students on this call, and I'm looking forward to engaging with students throughout this week and the faculty and the professional journalism community in Cairo as well. But even 10 years ago, if you were to go to your library, you might look at lithographs. You might actually look at old newspapers under a microscope. And the reality today is that what is shaping public policy and discourse and what has the potential to persuade people exists in a digital infrastructure. And it is our job as journalists to determine what is history, what accounts for real events that are transpiring in real time, and what is fake news. Now, I know as a promotional tactic, we titled the lecture History versus Fake News, and it is tantalizing and somewhat enticing to do that. But in reality, the term that we should be using is viral deception, not fake news, because the people who want us to employ the term fake news are often the purveyors and perpetuators of that deception in the context of politics or industry. And I think more than ever, journalists have to consider themselves not just the authors of the first draft of history, which has often been said, conventionally speaking, but they are the ones who are the investigators scrutinizing history and deciphering and differentiating between what is fact-based and what is either fantasy or fiction or propaganda. And what I attempted to do in the chapter that I'm going to read to you today from my book is give insight into 4 years ago, the presidential transition that occurred when Donald Trump was originally elected. What produced that climate and how these different media were exploited to try to disinform or misinform the electorate. And I think if we're going to use that term, viral deception, before I read a passage today, we ought to understand what it means, right? So viral, because never before in human history have we had the capability to reach each other this way via Zoom, to another continent, to another country, to another society, all part of globalization and the interconnectedness of today. But the amplification is instantaneous. It's not just that we can have a dialogue from continent to continent right now, which is fascinating and groundbreaking and innovative, but it's the speed, the velocity at which that travels. And the fact that in the early days of the American Republic, there were pamphleteers. You'll think of Tom Paine most famously in Common Sense, arguing for really the liberation and representation of this new country and this new people. And you'll think years later, not just the writing and ratification of the Constitution, before that, the Declaration of Independence, but one of the first American presidential campaigns, there were advocates of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams famously, when John Adams was seeking a second term in office after having succeeded George Washington. And that was the first campaign in which you saw an extensive amount of personal attacks, not as much public policy attacks, but a lot of that and a lot of vindictive ad hominem attacks too, that are not so different from what we experience in the political arena today. But the difference is those pamphleteers and the authors of those newspapers, they were reaching cottages, they were reaching farms, and people would diagnose it, they would dissect it, they would evaluate it, and then they would determine if it was history, if it was real, if it was based on their experience of living in Cambridge or in Richmond or wherever they were living at the time in the colonies or the first states, or they decide this is not my experience, this is not my fact, this is not how farming is transpiring in my state or my community. But they didn't have the ability to amplify it to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, if not billions of people. They also, as users, didn't have the opportunity to upload a video or upload that pamphlet to the web and get thousands upon thousands or millions of people to read it and to not have a check on it. And we know that social media largely exists today without any checks, without delineation of fact and fiction. Now, there are countries that have imposed some standards of discussion and discourse, and what that means varies from zip code to zip code or country to country. But the basic idea is that in the early American Republic, there was information and then there was mis or disinformation. But it did not have the opportunity to become viral in the same way it becomes viral now, meaning spread and unleashed like a wildfire. And we know deception is the act of deceiving someone. And I'll finally say that the difference between mis and disinformation, those terms that we tend to use often in the American political context today, is that misinformation largely was the term accepted and used for the vast majority of the last century. And that implied that people were making earnest mistakes. You know, my bad, I misquoted you. I didn't intend to misquote you. The misrepresentations and misinformation are often not deliberate, they're mistakes. Disinformation is lying to people on purpose and telling people to go out into the fields or onto the subway or into crowded facilities when they know, for instance, in the midst of this unprecedented pandemic, that it is deadly and that it is airborne. So disinformation doesn't have to be political. It can be medical disinformation, but disinformation can be extremely harmful and even lethal, and even in some ways can have the effect of injuring or killing people. So now that we've kind of contextualized this climate of misinformation, disinformation, the meaning of history, the meaning of viral deception or fake news, I want to read this passage and then I want to answer the professor's questions and any questions any of the participants have. And I know the professor has questions about this most recent election, which will be a very seamless diving off point from the end of this passage that I'm going to read. So this was originally updated in 2018, and this is the update from 2018. The 2014 midterm elections dealt a blow to the Democratic Senate majority, and with the Republicans in charge of both congressional chambers, the Obama administration was unable to build on its earlier progressive mandate for change. Moreover, when conservative Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died suddenly, the Republican majority denied an up or down vote or even a hearing to President Obama's moderate nominee, Judge Merrick Garland. In the face of obstructionism at home, President Obama focused his policy offensive on the world stage, including the negotiation to reduce Iranian nuclear activity, the normalization of Cuban-American relations, and the ratification of a Paris Accord to establish a global alliance against climate change. While economic recovery from the Great Recession continued into Obama's second term, the public remained wary of excess profits on Wall Street and stagnant wages on Main Street. And in spite of the steadily improving unemployment figures, income inequality in America widened and social mobility was scarce as a new high-tech Gilded Age reminiscent of the 1920s hollowed out the American middle class. According to his popular personal manner, Obama's approval hovered consistently around 50% for the duration of his second term. But brewing from unrealized policy objectives of the Occupy Wall Street movement and the conservative Tea Party movement was a coalition of populist fever. As the presidential campaign season dawned, a field of nearly 20 candidates emerged on the Republican side, including former Governor Jeb Bush, on the Democratic side, Secretary Hillary Clinton. However, the nation turned away from the political dynasties, the establishment of Clinton and Bush, in a search for a new leader. And no one more acutely tapped into that prevalent anti-establishment fervor than Republican candidate Donald Trump, a businessman and independent senator turned Democrat Bernie Sanders. Combusting the status quo, Trump pressed to make America great again, while Sanders promoted a political revolution. In the years preceding his White House bid, Trump had waged a media smear against President Obama, alleging his birthplace was not America. And for his efforts to delegitimize Obama, the first African-American president, Trump earned the trust of conservative media. He launched his campaign with a mix of nativist attacks on Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and compliments about his own business experience. His GOP rivals failed to consolidate their majority vote in most primaries and caucuses, and not since 1940 was there a presidential nominee with no political experience, only a businessman. Hillary Clinton faced new questions from the progressive constituency of the Democratic Party after being challenged by Senator Sanders, after disclosures about the Clinton campaign and Clinton's interference with the nominating process, Sanders delegates threatened to boycott the convention. While he ultimately calmed his youthful supporters into submission within the arena halls, Clinton's choice of similarly business-friendly Democrat Tim Kaine of Virginia did little to resolve the disunity that was apparent throughout the primary campaign. On the other hand, Donald Trump's shrewd selection of extremely conservative Indiana Governor Mike Pence coalesced the Christian right and assured right-wing confidence in the ticket. Citing crumbling third world infrastructure, loss of manufacturing jobs, and a plague of crime and illegal immigration in America, Trump pledged that he alone could fix it. Schooled in the McCarthy-era scare tactics, Trump warned that Hillary Clinton was proposing mass amnesty, mass immigration, and mass lawlessness. Trump and Clinton were the least popular presidential election candidates in recorded American history, according to the polls, and there was a desire for a third party, but no such choice emerged. Dogged by accusations of financial improprieties, Trump refused to release his tax returns, the first candidate in a modern era to do so. The real estate developer turned reality television star choreographed a blistering negative campaign against Hillary Clinton. He found his voice specifically on the social media platform Twitter, where he railed against a DC swamp of political insiders. If President Obama had been the nation's YouTube president, Trump hijacked the political process and media through his all-consuming and frequently disproven and fictional tweets. In the digital age of clickbait, Twitter and Facebook replaced the influence of newspapers and nightly newscasts. As author Neil Postman said in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, effectively hacking democratic institutions. But it was not without abetment, specifically from cyber agents who hijacked the DNC servers in an act of espionage targeting Secretary Clinton. According to foreign intelligence findings, Russian operatives under instruction from President Putin worked in concert with WikiLeaks, the anonymous source publisher of secret memos, to reveal the private correspondence of Clinton, including transcripts of speeches to financial institutions. Russia and Americans too planted bots and fake news stories on Facebook, the global social network, to disrupt American democracy. And while he initially pleaded ignorance, claiming that more than 99% of what people see is authentic on social media, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg and his peers at the helm of the new industry later conceded that the problem was significant and pledged to address misinformation. Despite their pledges, the problem remained graver than ever. Galvanized by WikiLeaks' attacks on Clinton, as well as the desire to claim Justice Scalia's seat, the vast majority of establishment rank-and-file Republicans ultimately backed their unusual standard bearer. In the biggest shock to the media establishment since the infamous Dewey beats Truman miss, Donald Trump won the Electoral College and thus the presidency in 2016, even as Secretary Clinton carried the majority vote by more than 3 million ballots. Uncertain was the course of the new Trump administration as the nation wondered whether the leader of the free world was no more. With the rising Democratic triumvirate of Macron of France, Trudeau of Canada, and Merkel of Germany, it seemed that way to a growing number of Americans. In his very dark inaugural address, President Trump touted a retreat from globalization, an America First vision of a country betrayed by the liberal order under President Obama. And once inaugurated, he continued to use Twitter to amplify ad hominem name-calling and attacks on the press. He appointed Neil Gorsuch to Scalia's vacant Supreme Court seat, enacted a travel ban against certain Muslim-majority countries, ended refugee asylum for victims of the raging Syrian civil war, and removed the United States from the Paris Accord. Investigated for collusion with Russia and the assault on Secretary Clinton, Trump's political victory was under the cloud of inappropriate, if not illegal behavior, inconsistent with longstanding electoral practices. Moreover, in firing the FBI director to halt an independent investigation and appointing his daughter and son-in-law to his White House, as well as a cabinet of billionaires, Trump's plutocratic authoritarianism tested democratic norms unlike any of his predecessors. And while GOP congressional leadership feared alienating his animated base and thus largely has ignored Trump's behavior, Republican conscientious objectors emerged on the scene. America has long suffered internal political discord. But in particular, US Senators John McCain and Jeff Flake of Arizona pointed to the administration's unprecedented exploitation of racial, religious, and cultural resentments. In the final sentence, and so the ideological pendulum of American politics had swung anew, but it had also left the prospect of a transformation from Republican to oligarchic or even autocratic government. And then I include the documents that are really important to this period, which include Donald Trump's tweets, Senator Sanders' victory speech when he won the New Hampshire primary in 2016, a Facebook post by Mark Zuckerberg explaining the misinformation crisis at Facebook, the essay by Neil Postman's son about America amusing itself to death, and testimony from social media executives on how they did not act in 2016. It's a hearing from 2017 in which senators are asking the social media leaders, what happened? What happened on your platforms to enable the spread of mis and disinformation? The basic point of that last sentence of that update is that America has seen a lot of twists and turns over the last 100 years in response to war, in response to now a pandemic. But the difference with Donald Trump in the reporting of our history, which is not fake news or viral deception, it's just fact, is that Donald Trump was the first president to come in office who had no political experience in 100 years, if not ever. I mean, almost all of our presidents had some political experience. Really, there were one or two who had more military experience than political experience. Eisenhower, namely, and Washington. But otherwise, all of our presidents have been elected, whether it was mayor or governor or senator or in some kind of public policy position. Donald Trump was not, and it was the first cabinet in history that had all millionaires. And it was the first administration since Kennedy to employ family members. So there were a lot of differences, and those are just facts. And I think it's important to speak about facts, not about the agenda, because there are conservatives, people who take the position of Republicans in this country. They support the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. They support measures to curb abortion or life as they see it. And then there are people who support the right to abortion, for instance. There are people who want gun regulation, gun safety measures. And all those people, even if they have different views on social issues, I think they want to see facts. They want to know facts. And so that was my attempt to factually understand what transpired in 2016. With that, I'm very happy to answer the professor's questions and any other questions that you all have.
Thank you, Alexander. That was very fascinating. I've always been fascinated with the rise of Donald Trump. I think it's an incredible lesson in history to look at how a number of different circumstances and factors came together to create a completely new segment of American politics, which is Trumpism. But so before I ask you your questions, I just want to tell our attendees that they can raise their hands if they have questions, and I will call upon them to voice their question, or they can write in the Q&A box, and I will relay those questions to Alexander. My first question to you is, given that between 1990 and maybe 2010, we were kind of, as a human society, in the throes of what everyone was calling the age of information. But since 2010, we started seeing populist movements as well as freedom movements around the world. And that slowly changed to, dare I say, the age of disinformation and misinformation. Well, first misinformation, then the age of disinformation. We were on the information highway, and that quickly turned into the information swamp, if I can call it that. So I want to ask you: are you, as a media pundit yourself, and as someone who is basically documenting history, are you surprised that social media and whatever other media tools we had in our at our disposal, are you surprised that this actually happened since the 2016 election?
Well, I think your preface to the question, which was describing the evolution or devolution from information highway to swamp, I think that is precisely correct. And I think that the American system developed uh, a communications apparatus at the advent of television and radio. And that was some rules of the road that ownership of frequency of radio or television station did not allow you to um, disinform people. It was not a right to lie to people and say, this is the evening newscast and X, Y, and Z happened, and in fact X, Y, and Z did not happen. And maybe it was the responsibility of the first journalists in those mediums who understood the difference between informing news and entertainment. We know that when radio and TV came to fruition, immediately there was both entertainment and news, and that there was a line drawn between the two, because with news, if there is a fire, if there are toxins in the water, if there is a pandemic, as there is now, or in the case of radio, if there's a global conflagration in World War II, people want to know about, factually how their nation is doing, if they have a brother, in the armed forces overseas, or father or son. They want access to factual information. And so in the beginning of radio and TV, there was that public trust that was established. And later it was kind of sanctioned and formalized and fortified by the Federal Communication Commission, the FCC in the United States. And as the new internet age dawned, the FCC completely took a back seat. So none of the original infrastructure that was managing the information highway, because there was an information highway of the 50s and earlier on. I mean, it's not as if radio and TV were assumed that those innovations would happen. And so when you ask me if I'm surprised that not enough people understand the history there. And I think that's a good companion to the passage that I read, because you would ask precisely the question you asked: why is this happening when America had been a leader in communications integrity? And there are various specific policies we can talk about. One is called the Fairness Doctrine, about giving time to, equal time to candidates from all of the parties in the case of a political campaign. I know France, for instance, has very rigid and strict media laws. It's not censorship, it's regulation around how speech can be allocated fairly in the midst of a political season. And the internet came, and initially the FCC being responsive to the internet was not necessary, because we were talking about just email. We were talking about people privately communicating with each other, and there was no business at all in even considering regulation. This is basically the mail. The mailman doesn't read your letter, and nor should he ever. Once we talked about networks of information, of news gatherers and citizen journalists and platforms that are reaching millions or billions of people, then you would think there would need to be some kind of apparatus. And I think that the basic difference between censorship and classification is that classification understands that there are people who want to live in a world of fiction. There are people who maybe don't follow the news or not interested in reading the news. But that doesn't give them the right, in my opinion, as a working journalist, to manipulate the people who do care about facts. And that really is the tension right now between the people who want to reform social media and the people who want to keep it exactly the same.
Okay, thank you. That really sheds light on that. We have a question from Mohammed Samir. Mohammed, go ahead. If you can unmute yourself, Mohammed.
Yes, of course. I'm sorry. Hello.
Yes, hello, go ahead.
Hello, Professor Hafner. My name is Muhannad. I wanted to ask you a question. When there's a media personnel, whether it's a news reporter or a news anchor on channel, they have the responsibility, the responsibility delegated to them that they have to communicate news in an honest manner. But the thing is, on social media, it's so easy for someone who's just having fun to become very popular, and now they don't have that responsibility per se. How can we regulate that if they do not take that responsibility on themselves, given that they have the free speech to say whatever they want?
Very good question.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very difficult subject. It's a really important conversation to have following the discussion that we just had. With respect to regulation, there are the two models that I described. There's the censorship model and the classification model. And I think that, you know, news personalities can be different from entertainment personalities in the sense that their objective is different. You know, someone may be called a news personality, but if they actually are faithful to the profession of journalism, they're putting journalism before themselves. They're putting journalism before their popularity, or being able to say something that is provocative just because it's provocative. And so I think that that's the important distinction to draw. And I know that it's hard because lines have been blurred in such enormous ways that it's hard to see the difference between a news personality and an entertainment personality. And I think in most countries with that have a television system, the goal of the television system is to keep you watching. And even in countries that don't have necessarily the same human rights as other countries, the motivation is still the same in wanting to keep you watching. So in a sense, every country that has a system that is open, an open press or a partially free press or a fully free press, that the TV model is one that tries to keep you entertained. Now, from the American perspective, this is the light that I can shed on this. I've found in my career that there are ways to be highly engaging and entertaining, if you want to call that, at the same time that you're trying to facilitate useful outcomes for constituents. One second. Sorry, I thought I had to sneeze, but it passed. Let me give you some background. So Neil Postman, the NYU media critic, wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he feared what you described in your question, which was that the hardware of our media system was becoming less and less sacred and less tied to the facts and tied to the context of those facts. And so he felt that as we were deteriorating from books to essays to pamphlets to tweets, there's a middle ground there, which is sound bites, and there are radio sound bites and TV sound bites. But that kind of devolution from the expectation that a citizen is going to read something and care enough about a subject matter to get a significant amount of context, that is why the hardware has changed and why the meme, the photograph, the little short video are most appealing to citizens around the world. It's a global phenomenon. I don't think it's a distinctly American phenomenon, even if America has kind of led the pop culture revolution that started long before 2020. But what I would say is, there are experiments, and America hasn't really done it successfully yet, and I don't know that any country has. When I spoke at the MIT Media Lab, there's a young Indian American woman who said there has been some experimentation with this model in India. But the idea of the reality TV is how Donald Trump was elected. It was the idea that you can be a star, you can have a personality by itself, and that is strong enough to win a presidential election. The difference is that you can try to use entertainment to amuse people in a constructive way, to get them to pay attention to issues that matter. And as a kind of addendum to the Neil Postman idea, how do we amuse democracy back to life? Or how do we amuse our fellow citizens to be responsible, to be compassionate, to be empathetic, and to help, with the kind of policy making that's going to allow society to flourish. And so in the American context, I think there have been all kinds of reality TV shows long before Netflix on the major channels. And I've often encouraged friends in media who work at the big networks that have entertainment operations, unlike public television, which is purely education, to say, you can use The Amazing Race or The Survivor or any of those formats to actually engender some constructive change for society. And I always imagined, we have separation of powers here in the United States. We have the executive branch, three branches of government: the executive branch, the judicial branch led by the Supreme Court, and the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is what is central to actually making legislation happen. So when there is relief for the pandemic, the president can't just authorize that himself. It has to be approved by Congress, and money has to be allocated by Congress. So it was my idea, and it still is my idea, and maybe with someone like President-elect Biden, this is going to gain some new momentum, that you could take two really decent people in the political process from different parties and bring them together in the kind of reality TV mindset. I always thought of this with the late Senator John McCain, because he would have been a person who would have really thrived in this role, but kind of live with them, wake up with their morning coffee and their Washington Post and see how they live, and then pick a Democrat from another state. And so I think that's really the way to be. Your question was, what's the solution to that problem? And I think that that's the solution to the problem. Taking the modes of entertainment that make people want to follow you and adopting them in serious contexts where policies need to be addressed to help your country or help your society.
Thank you, Alexander. We have a question from a young upcoming journalist, Yakin, who is asking about major networks and some of the opinions that are expressed on major networks. I personally watched so much CNN during the Trump presidency, and I was just horrified by how rapid the decline of their standards was. So Yakin is asking, opinion news, and this is basically what major news broadcasters are just becoming shells for opinion news. He's asking, opinion news, even on major networks, can be misinforming. Should we check these for disinformation? Should they be allowed on a news network?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I understand the premise of the question and the fact that people view media today with skepticism and ulterior motives of, trying to advance political agendas. I mean, I do think that this particular election cycle in this context, because Donald Trump was an anomaly in the history of the American presidency. It gave people a variety of ways to want to attack him. And so, I think that he himself, of course, was someone who would attack his political opponents and would often say the media is his political opponent. And he called it the enemy of the people. And I think that to the extent that there was a lower news standard, I think that that was actually a climate that Trump wanted to create, where he was going to war with the media, and the media was continuing to do its job, but was also at war with him, and part of that being at war with him is justified, in my opinion, because it's about the preservation of truth. I myself do not think that the way in which anonymous sourcing has been used in the last 10 years, even prior to the Trump administration, has been healthy for the profession. So, I think that anonymous sourcing was used far less liberally in the first stage of the new information highway, whether that's Web 1.0, whether it was Yahoo, and just sort of the beginning of the transformation. Anonymous sourcing can be pivotal in the development of stories and getting people to speak, who are whistleblowers and truth tellers and want to engage constructively and help inform society. But a lot of the anonymous reporting that was done, that CNN would pick up on and others would pick up on, would be in the kind of way that Trump was dishing out criticism himself, which was just negativity, often quoting people within his administration who were. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in the sense that there's nothing. Let me say that there's something, I think, socially and ethically problematic about it. There's nothing illegal about it. And I don't think there should be anything illegal about it. But I think that at no point did the higher ups, the news executives, or the editors of publications say, we need to hold back on the anonymous sourcing. And when it's very important to the public health and to public knowledge and to the development of our stories, we're going to use it. So there was a lessening of standards when it came to anonymous reporting. And I think that maybe more than anything else in the media is responsible for the perception that you articulated.
Thank you. I actually have a follow-up question from one of the journalism students, Lemma. She says, how can citizens, journalists, and digital platforms and office, or I guess she means stakeholders, work together since everyone has a different perspective? So we're talking about the core definition of how democracy works when everyone comes from a different angle or a different political conviction.
That's a wonderful question. Again, I think that from the American perspective, there's always been a faith in freedom of expression and speech, because it's so kind of interwoven in our founding history, that we wanted free speech, and we wanted representation in the country. In our definition of representation or speech was to be able to elect our own governors and our own mayors independent of British control, if you think about the founding of our history. So there is something that unites Americans, just as there's something that unites a lot of countries in the founding principle of what we are seeking to accomplish and what every generation attempts to continue. And so I think that in the United States, I think that the vast majority of people have shared goals for prosperity and for freedom. The folks you mentioned, the different groups of people, journalists, policymakers, citizens, speaking broadly of citizens, like, just think about it in the context of the pandemic. Every one of those groups wants to protect their families and continue to be able to have the freedom to go to the local pizzeria and to be able to engage in commerce, and at the same time people want to protect their health. And there's no doubt there are tensions in the way that America thinks about those issues. And there's also, just on a psychological level, some people are prepared to be more patient with their fellow Americans, and some people are willing to be more patient with the people they elect to the presidency. So, I think that there are ways to mediate and to forge consensus among those three groups, even if they have slightly different perspectives. And those perspectives are things that I'm going to talk about in the workshop with both the professional journalists and the student journalists a little later on this week, because I think there are ways that you can more specifically try to tackle the disagreement with those groups. And specifically, I think it comes down to understanding the source of people's resentment and their aspirations. And what I mean by that is, people live with the baggage that has been dealt them, whether they are just citizens speaking from journalist perspectives of how their sources treat them, how their editors treat them, how the government respects or disrespects them. And then, of course, policy officials, whether we're talking about elected office holders or we're talking about health policy advisors, and whether, the health advisors feel like they're being listened to by the president, and whether the doctors think they're being listened to by the health advisors. And there is a cycle, and that cycle is going to be most effective in understanding each other if, people understand each other from the ground level up. So when we're talking about the pandemic, talk about nurses and first responders and doctors and health advisors and secretaries of cabinet level agencies and health advisors and presidents and prime ministers. And there, obviously, over the course of this pandemic, we've seen there's a big breakdown in the communication and in the respect that people can have for those groups. But here's where I bring in that point about resentment and aspiration. Everybody comes to their job, whether they're a journalist, again, or a policymaker, with history, with baggage, and with hopes, with hopes to, in the case of the pandemic, with hopes to bring about resolution as quickly as humanly possible with the advances of vaccines and scientific endeavor to produce vaccinations and therapeutics. And it's not enough to understand that people have different perspectives. We need to understand how people arrived at those different perspectives. And in some forms of government, because of an absence of free speech or human rights or exchange or kind of openness, I always think about the British system and the Prime Minister's questions as a beautiful way of confronting issues and having the opposite party question the party in power, and do it in a playful way, a respectful way, but a way that the whole country, in the case of the United Kingdom, can watch and understand. And even in America, I don't think over the last 4 years we've had the kind of accountability that a prime minister's questions type format allows for the country's head to be grilled by the opposition party, and grilled in, use the word you want, grilled, interrogated, analyzed, but ultimately at the end of the day, that prime minister has to hear out the perspectives and understand the origin what caused those people to have those perspectives. And so it very much depends on the kind of democracy you live in, or the kind of elections you have, and the kind of rights-based systems you have. But in an ideal world, whether we're talking about a developed country or a developing country, or a quasi-democracy or a fuller democracy, at the end of the day, it's about people's ability to understand how you formed a conviction, but not what your perspective is. That's just the sort of the icing on the cake. That's just the most superficial kind of way to get in. But then what caused you to feel that way, which is not always a pleasant thing to explain or extrapolate on, that's the meat. That's what journalists care about a lot. And I think that if policymakers and elected office holders understood that journalists, in wanting to represent the truth to the great number of people, are not as concerned about whether or not you disagree with them, or there's many of us try to put our own thoughts, subjective analyses in perspective. We're more concerned about why you came to that conclusion, how you came to that conclusion or that perspective. And it's in that discussion that I think you can get a lot done.
Speaking of getting a lot done, I actually have a forward-looking question. You touched on the pandemic and so many other things that are kind of Americans are struggling with on a daily basis now. Moving forward, and with the Biden administration being so much more receptive to the issue of COVID-19 than the Trump administration, how do you think the media, even Fox News, will work with the new Biden administration in addressing some of the conspiracy theories and some of the hack science, which is telling you the masks are actually bad for you, or 5G networks are the cause of all this? How do you think the media is going to work with the Biden administration? I see you laughing there. With the Biden administration in addressing these issues?
Well, I think that the social media companies will recognize that it's in their best interest to no longer feed into the conspiracies. And I think that as long as the Biden administration sees it as counter to their objective to overcome the pandemic, that these media platforms are rife with disinformation, that there is going to be a level of accountability that there hasn't been. Now, I do think there's an element of any new administration that is naive, and that it lives in kind of a fantasy world where they're going to take over and the stars are going to align instantaneously. And I do fear that. I do fear that the Biden administration is not going to be as bold as it needs to be in the kind of regulation or classification of new media that needs to take place. What I was talking about before, which is the need for platforms like YouTube, like Facebook, like Twitter, to have more of a library environment where, you go into a library or you go into a bookstore, historically speaking, there is the autobiography section, there is the fiction section, but there is a very clear delineation between children's books or fiction or fairy tales and nonfiction, reality, fact-based events, whether it's historical documents or historical writings. And I think that if the Biden administration thinks that it can accept the status quo of the social media climate as it exists today with just a little tweak here and there, they're going to fail, and it's going to be a very easy way for someone Donald Trump, if not someone else, to get back on, to get reelected in 4 years, and to kind of rewrite the history of this period in the way that, again, is not consistent with the facts.
Thank you, Alexander. Yeah, well, there's been a lot of people are looking at the numbers in the U.S. elections that Trump got 74 million of the popular vote. So the Biden administration certainly has its work cut out for it. And Trumpism is something that's not going to go away anytime soon. And I expect Trump to use the next 4 years as a platform to criticize the Biden administration the same way that he did with the Obama administration. What advice would you have if someone from the Biden administration came and asked you, how should we respond to what Trump is doing?
That's a great question. I think that it depends on how and what Trump does. So if he does, as you're kind of suggesting, when there's an inauguration of Biden, have a rally declaring his campaign for 2020, it will be harder to just press the mute button. Even if he didn't do that, it would be hard to press the mute button given everything that's transpired over the last 4 years. I think that it will be important to continue to contrast his message about public health with the prior administrations. In the same way Obama contrasted his approach to the economic situation to what happened at the end of the Bush administration, and the second term of the Bush administration with the Great Recession. But whether or not he decides to take the bait and respond to specific things Trump says, I think that his strategy of largely muting Trump will be effective if he is shown to engage with those people who voted for Trump. And I think that, he's the kind of person with his values of decency that in his rhetoric of decency that I could see, even if the pandemic is not resolved in the first 2 years of his presidency, which it unlikely will be, that he's the kind of person who, if he's really committed to governing and to running for re-election, that there are people who voted for Trump not just in 2016, but again in 2020, who will respect his attempts to build the bridge. And I mean, you're talking about apples and oranges in terms of, I would say you're talking about apples and rancid meat in the sense of like, a more decent approach to human beings. I mean, we know, objectively speaking, how these two men comport themselves. And it's not to say that Biden did not attack Trump during the campaign. He did. But we also know that there was a authenticity in his communication and his response to most of Trump's attacks during the debates was like, come on, man. And, the whole aura of not wanting to stoop to that level. We know that he had a really strong platform to attack Trump's family, and he never did. And the Republican campaign plot to try to arrest Biden's momentum was with Hunter Biden, his son, and his business dealings. And it didn't work, or it didn't work with enough people. But we know that Trump has had multiple scandals involving his family. And as I said, was the first president since Kennedy, and maybe the only president other than Kennedy to appoint, family. And I don't know that any administration had appointed multiple family members to government posts and had bypassed the normal processes for security clearance and diplomatic status, which was just an example of really abandoning the sort of years-long practice. America was not founded as a royal family or a country where there is a queen or a king and they can just appoint their heir, their son-in-law, their daughter to whatever positions. That's not what America has experienced. So Biden had a really open window to do that, and he never did it. Now, certainly surrogates of his, just like surrogates of Trump, attacked from every angle their opponent. But Biden refused to go in that direction. And as a result, I think people saw him in a different light. And, you know, he has his work cut out from him, like you said. But I don't think it will be effective or needed for him to respond to Trump's tweets. I think he should largely view Trump as a non-entity after he's inaugurated until it becomes clear that he's the nominee, the Republican nominee. There might be some variation on that answer depending upon what happens over these next couple months and what Trump tries to do to, you know, we know that there's reporting that there's specifically diplomacy that's been going on in the Middle East, and agitation of some Iranian influence in the region, because it's expected that Biden will want to renegotiate with Iran and will want to kind of reset a Middle Eastern policy that is different from Trump's. And we know that from the reporting that and from the clear actions of our secretaries, the current Secretary of State, that they're trying to create traps so that it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to have very constructive dialogue. And I don't think it's just with the Iranians. I think it's overall, they want to destabilize relationships and make it harder to navigate, specifically in the Middle East. And you know, and so if there were to be ways in which Trump tried to interfere with relationships, foreign relationships, while he's not president anymore, then there might be a different answer to the question.
Thank you, Alexander. That was certainly very Machiavellian approach by the Trump non-administration.
Right.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I could have gone on for hours and hours picking your brain. I want to thank everybody who showed up and the great questions that were asked today. Very astute and show a great knowledge of the issues facing social media on a global scale and on a more domestic U.S. scale. Alexander, I wish you well. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you all for attending, and I look forward to speaking with more of you as the week progresses.
Very good.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.